It started with a sound that was neither thunder nor applause, but a smug chuckle rolling out from John Boehner's lips. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even clever, but it cut through the room like a blade of contempt. Cameras caught it instantly, the smirk pulling at his face, the casual tilt of a man who believed he was untouchable. A laugh meant to diminish, to belittle, to remind everyone watching who thought he held the power. The room shifted. Some eyes darted downward, uneasy. Others widened, surprised at the brazenness. The chuckle lingered in the air, bouncing off the walls of the chamber, carried further by microphones and camera feeds streaming live to millions. Social media lit up within seconds. A clip of Boehner's grin, frozen and looped, hashtag after hashtag bubbling to the surface. To the country watching at home, it was more than a laugh. It was a performance of arrogance, and Jasmine Crockett felt it. The moment was meant for her. She was the target, the one expected to shrink, to falter under the weight of that condescending sound. But she didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She stood still, her shoulders squared, her gaze fixed forward, as if the laugh had only revealed what she already knew, that men like Boehner had dismissed voices like hers for generations. The crowd leaned in. Reporters scribbled notes, unsure if this was just another forgettable jab or the start of something historic. On Twitter, the commentary came sharp and fast. Did Boehner just laugh at her? On live TV, another voice followed. This is going to backfire, because this wasn't just a laugh. It was a signal. It was a declaration of hierarchy, a warning that the old guard still believed they could sneer down at newcomers, especially women of color who dared to challenge them. The arrogance of it made stomachs turn, fists tighten, and eyes sharpen, and then silence. The laugh faded, but the room did not relax. It braced. It knew something was coming. What began with a laugh would end in political ashes. But what Jasmine said next flipped the entire room upside down. This wasn't just a hearing. It wasn't just another dry exchange between a former Speaker of the House and a rising representative. What unfolded in that chamber was a collision of eras, a confrontation between the swagger of the old establishment and the steady fire of a new generation. John Boehner came into that room carrying decades of power, prestige, and a Rolodex of allies who had once treated his smirk as law. Jasmine Crockett came with none of that. What she carried instead was something the cameras couldn't look away from. Authenticity, sharpened by struggle, armored in dignity. And that contrast was the heartbeat of the moment. Boehner, the seasoned veteran, believed he was presiding over a formality. To him, Crockett was another upstart politician, young and ambitious, too green to matter. He had dismissed dozens before her, men and women who bent under the subtle weight of his ridicule. In his mind, this would be no different. A laugh, a quip, and the audience would move on, the hierarchy preserved. But to Crockett, the stakes were higher than his chuckle suggested. She knew every set of eyes in that chamber, and millions more beyond the lens, were watching to see if she would stumble. She represented more than her seat. She carried the weight of communities too often dismissed, voices too often talked over, identities too often told to wait their turn. For her, silence wasn't an option. Every word mattered. Every breath carried consequence. That's why the chuckle struck like a match in dry grass. It wasn't just a laugh at her. It was a laugh at everyone who had ever been told they weren't polished enough, weren't experienced enough, weren't worthy enough to stand toe-to-toe with the establishment. It mocked the very idea that someone like her could hold the floor, and in that mockery the old arrogance revealed itself. The audience felt it. Progressive viewers watching from across the country saw themselves in Crockett's steady poise. They felt the sting of that laugh, as if it echoed through boardrooms where their voices were dismissed, classrooms where their questions were ignored, workplaces where their talent was overlooked. The stakes had leapt beyond a single hearing. This was about validation, about dignity, about a refusal to be minimized. And then there was the generational tension. Boehner embodied the politics of smoke-filled rooms and handshakes behind closed doors. Crockett embodied the era of viral clips, grassroots momentum, and transparency that couldn't be hidden from the digital age. In a way, the hearing was the perfect stage. Cameras everywhere, sound bites ripe for circulation, the clash of styles impossible to contain. Every smirk Boehner offered only deepened the divide. Every glance Crockett returned made clear she would not play the part he had written for her. Viewers could sense it, the tremor before the quake, the shift before the collapse. This wasn't background noise. It was the prelude to something seismic. Little did anyone know this wasn't just another hearing. It was the moment that would rewrite political history. To understand the weight of that laugh, you have to understand the man behind it. John Boehner was not some passing figure in American politics. He had once held the gavel as Speaker of the House, third in line to the presidency, commanding the chamber with the kind of authority that came less from inspiration than from backroom bargaining and backslaps exchanged in smoke-filled corridors. To many in Washington, he was the embodiment of the establishment, unshakable, unbothered, and untouchable. His career had been built on a carefully cultivated image, an Ohio son with a gravelly voice, a cigarette in one hand and a deal in the other. He talked endlessly about dignity, about civility, about the decorum of public life. But beneath the speeches and the calls for unity lay another reality. Boehner thrived on the subtle smirk, the offhand jab, the laugh that dismissed opponents without ever engaging their arguments. For him, politics wasn't just about winning votes. It was about projecting dominance, and in that dominance, the contradictions piled high. He spoke of bipartisanship, but mocked anyone who dared challenge his caucus. He preached about elevating dialogue while reducing colleagues to punchlines behind closed doors. He posed as the weary statesman, above the fray, yet delighted in the performative cruelty that signaled to insiders he was still in control. To the press corps that followed him for years, the smirk was as much a part of his brand as his tan and his ever-present glass of red wine. This was the old guard's way. Dismiss the challenger, mock the outsider, laugh off the inconvenient. And for years it worked. Critics sputtered, then faded. Rivals bristled, then bowed. His smirk became a shield, his laugh a weapon. But arrogance leaves a residue. People remember being laughed at. They remember being diminished. And slowly that residue hardened into resentment, not just from Democrats, but from younger Republicans who grew tired of his deals, tired of his dismissals, tired of the way he carried himself, as if politics was a private club and he was the bouncer at the door. The hypocrisy was hard to miss. Here was a man who demanded respect, yet rarely offered it in return. He invoked dignity while rolling his eyes at new voices. He claimed to honor the institution while using it to elevate his circle of allies. To the outsider, it was elitism. To those who lived under it, it was suffocating. And perhaps Boehner believed he could keep laughing forever. After all, hadn't it worked before? For decades he had leaned on the same tricks. A chuckle here, a dismissal there, a grand speech about unity while quietly undermining those who threatened his place. He had survived challenges, scandals, even government shutdowns, always with that same weary grin. His reputation as the old lion of Congress seemed unshakable, even as the political landscape shifted beneath his feet. But arrogance has an expiration date. It blinds its owner to change. Boehner failed to see that the country had grown weary of dismissive elites, weary of smirks that stood in place of arguments, weary of being told to sit quietly while the powerful laughed in their faces. The digital age had sharpened accountability. Every expression, every chuckle, every smirk was captured, dissected, and shared at the speed of a tweet. The tactics that once worked in closed rooms now unfolded under the harsh light of viral scrutiny. And that was the stage Boehner stepped onto the day he faced Jasmine Crockett. He carried with him decades of instinct. Laugh it off, diminish the challenger, assert dominance through arrogance. What he didn't carry was awareness of the new battlefield. The cameras were no longer passive. The audience was no longer deferential. And Crockett was no ordinary opponent. For years, he'd laughed off critics. But this time the laughter wouldn't last. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever walked into that chamber, long before cameras traced her every expression, and millions waited to see how she would respond, she had lived a life that prepared her for this exact kind of moment. Hers was not the polished path of privilege or the backroom grooming of party insiders. It was a story stitched together by grit, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of justice in places where justice often felt absent. She grew up hearing the quiet struggles of families around her, neighbors, who worked 2 jobs yet still came up short at the end of the month, classmates whose dreams were clipped before they ever left the ground. Those early lessons didn't make her cynical. They made her restless. She learned quickly that the world didn't hand out dignity. You had to fight for it, sometimes claw for it, and almost always demand it from people who were eager to deny it. Jasmine carried that restlessness into adulthood. Before politics ever called her name, she worked as a public defender, standing beside people who had little more than the clothes on their backs and the truth in their hearts. Day after day she entered courtrooms stacked against the poor, the vulnerable, the overlooked, and she fought anyway. It wasn't glamorous work. It didn't win her applause or accolades, but it honed something far more important: fearlessness. Because when you've stood before a judge with a client who had no one else, when you've been the single barrier between an unjust system and a human life it was ready to consume, you learn how to hold your ground. You learn how to steady your voice even when everything around you feels tilted against you. You learn how to take a sneer, a smirk, a condescending laugh, and refuse to shrink. Her style wasn't the polished kind Washington insiders preferred. She didn't sand down her edges, didn't coat her words in euphemisms designed to make the powerful comfortable. She spoke plainly, sometimes bluntly, always authentically. To some it seemed unpolished. To others it was electric. And to those who had spent their whole lives waiting for someone to speak their truth without apology, it was revolutionary. Community service wasn't just a bullet point on a resume for her, it was the air she breathed. She spent weekends at local events, not for photo ops but to listen. She marched, she volunteered, she organized. People knew her not as some distant figure on a ballot, but as Jasmine, the woman who would stop, look you in the eye, and hear your story. That authenticity became her armor. No smirk could dent it. No dismissal could erase it. But what truly set her apart was the resilience stitched into every chapter of her journey. She had faced setbacks, insults, and all the little ways the establishment tried to remind her she didn't belong. And each time she rose. Each time she came back sharper, steadier, more determined than before. Where others sought comfort in compromise, she found strength in defiance. Where others retreated to safety, she leaned into the fire. It was this resilience that made her more than just a politician. She was a mirror for every person who had ever been underestimated, every immigrant who had been told they didn't belong, every young woman who had been talked over in meetings, every voice that had been told to wait its turn. She carried those scars proudly, not as weaknesses, but as proof that she could endure what others could not. And perhaps that's why her presence in Congress was so magnetic. She wasn't there to mimic the establishment or to play by its quiet rules. She was there to challenge, to confront, to insist that dignity belonged to everyone, not just to those who had laughed their way to power. So when John Boehner chuckled in that chamber, it wasn't the first time Jasmine Crockett had heard that kind of sound. She had heard it in courtrooms from prosecutors who underestimated her. She had heard it in debates where opponents dismissed her as inexperienced. She had heard it in meetings where colleagues assumed her silence meant submission. That laugh was familiar. It was the soundtrack of every battle she had already fought and survived. And that was why she didn't flinch. Why her eyes didn't dart away. Why her shoulders didn't sag under the weight of his condescension. She had lived through that sound before, and every time she came out stronger. She embodied dignity not because it was granted to her, but because she had forged it, battle by battle, wound by wound. And in that chamber, as cameras zoomed in and the world held its breath, she stood as living proof that dignity cannot be laughed away, and it was precisely these battles that made her ready for the moment Boehner laughed. The moment Jasmine Crockett opened her mouth, the air in the chamber thickened. She began with the steady rhythm of someone who had been here before, not in this exact arena, not before this exact opponent, but in the presence of arrogance that thought it could smother her voice. Her words were calm, deliberate, drawing a clear line between truth and performance, and then, as if on cue, John Boehner interrupted. Another chuckle, sharper this time, carrying over her words like a gust of wind meant to extinguish a flame. His shoulders shook with the confidence of a man certain the room was on his side. Some of his allies echoed the sound with muffled snickers, their laughter layering over hers like a chorus of dismissal. It was the sound of power mocking its challenger, the sound of history repeating itself. But the room did not laugh unanimously. There were gasps, quick intakes of breath, eyes narrowing as they turned to Boehner. Reporters glanced up from their notepads, realizing this wasn't routine anymore. The tension split the chamber in two, one half amused by the performance, the other half unsettled by its brazenness. Crockett did not rush. She did not shout over him. Instead, she paused, an intentional silence that pulled attention back to her. Cameras caught her expression, composed, unshaken, even faintly bemused, as though Boehner's laughter only confirmed the very point she was making. That poise was disarming, and the audience leaned in closer, waiting to see how she would answer. Boehner, emboldened by his own sound, pressed further. He leaned back in his chair, a grin stretching wider, the kind of grin that dared her to keep going. He muttered a quip under his breath, loud enough for those near him to catch, quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. His ally smirked again. To him, this was sport. To him, this was the old playbook working exactly as it always had. Yet with each laugh, each grin, each interruption, the balance in the room began to shift. The arrogance that once seemed untouchable now looked like insecurity. His attempts to rattle her only drew more eyes to her steadiness, more sympathy to her side. Every second she held her ground, the room recalibrated. The tension reached its breaking point when Crockett leaned ever so slightly toward the microphone, her gaze unwavering. The silence stretched. Even Boehner's grin faltered, if only for a flicker, as he realized she was not going to retreat. The audience waited. Reporters poised their pens. The cameras zoomed tighter, the buzz of social media spiking with every second of anticipation, and then she spoke again. Jasmine Crockett did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm was its own power, a steady flame in a chamber where arrogance tried to snuff out dignity. She let the silence hang for just a moment longer, long enough for Boehner's chuckle to echo in everyone's ears, long enough for the room to lean forward in expectation. And then she began. "Mr. Boehner," she said, her tone even but cutting, "you've spent your career laughing. Laughing at opponents, laughing at communities you don't understand, laughing as though dismissiveness is the same thing as leadership. But let's talk about what your laughter has actually built." The words landed like the first stones of an avalanche. Boehner shifted in his chair, the grin still clinging to his face, though slightly tighter now. A few allies chuckled again, but the sound was weaker, more uncertain. Crockett continued, "Deliberate, methodical. You talk about dignity, about civility. Yet when working families were begging for relief, you walked away and called it politics. When the country was bleeding from a shutdown, you smiled for cameras, as if suffering were a bargaining chip. And here you sit today smirking, as though history has forgotten who you were and what you did." A murmur rippled through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed closer to Boehner's face, capturing the moment the chuckle at the corner of his mouth stalled. Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned in closer to the microphone. "You laughed at the Affordable Care Act as if it were a joke. But tell me, was it funny to the mother who could finally afford her child's medication? You laughed at climate bills, at student relief, at protections for communities like mine. Was it funny when families drowned in debt? Was it funny when children coughed through polluted air? Was it funny when seniors rationed medicine?" The silence that followed was electric. This wasn't a speech. It was a cross-examination, a dismantling in real time. Each question dug deeper. Each example chipped away at the facade of power Boehner had relied on for decades. He tried to respond with another grin, but the camera caught his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing just slightly. It was subtle, but in a room trained on every twitch of expression, it was glaring. Crockett pressed on. "You see, arrogance has always been your armor. That chuckle, that smirk. It's the mask you wear to avoid accountability. But here's the truth. Laughter doesn't erase your record. It doesn't erase the deals you cut that left working families behind. It doesn't erase the shutdowns, the stalemates, the broken promises. And it certainly doesn't erase the dismissiveness you've shown every time someone dared to challenge you." There it was, the shift. Boehner's allies grew quiet. No chuckles now. The smirk that had once controlled the room was being turned into evidence against him, each grin becoming a reminder of the very arrogance she was exposing. The chamber was no longer laughing with him. It was waiting for her. Crockett paused again, letting the weight of her words settle. The silence wasn't empty. It was charged, alive, humming with anticipation. She let the cameras drink in Boehner's face, then continued. I came here knowing exactly what would happen. You'd laugh. You'd dismiss me. You'd treat my presence as beneath you. But here's what you didn't calculate. I've been laughed at before. My community has been laughed at before. Immigrants, women, black voices, we've all been laughed at. And every time we've answered. Every time we've risen higher than those who tried to keep us down. And every time the laughter has faded while the truth remained. The audience stirred. A few quiet claps slipped out before being hushed. Viewers watching online clipped the moment instantly, flooding feeds with hashtags like Crockett Clapback and Laugh No More. The hearing itself was slipping into something bigger, something unforgettable. Boehner, for the first time, looked uneasy. His hands fidgeted on the desk, his eyes darted briefly toward his allies, but found no encouragement there. The smirk had drained into something thinner, something closer to discomfort. Crockett drove the point home. Respect isn't measured in how loudly you laugh at others. It's measured in how you serve the people who trust you, and by that measure, your smirk is your legacy. Dismissive, arrogant, small. But here's the difference between us, Mr. Boehner. I don't need to laugh at you to prove my point. My dignity speaks louder than your arrogance ever could. The words dropped like a hammer. The chamber fell still, the silence louder than any applause. Boehner blinked, his lips pressed together now, the smirk gone. The cameras lingered on him, capturing the transformation, the mighty veteran, reduced not by shouting or insults, but by the calm certainty of a younger, sharper voice who refused to be diminished. Crockett let the silence hang one last time. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk in return. She simply straightened her shoulders, her gaze unwavering. And then she delivered the final line. The one that would echo far beyond that chamber, replayed in clips, quoted in headlines, etched into political memory. The laugh that began the exchange would be the last one you would dare that day. The silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's mic drop was short-lived. Within seconds, the chamber erupted. Some in the audience gasped aloud. Others muttered under their breath, and a ripple of nervous laughter swept through Boehner's allies. Except this time, it wasn't confidence. It was shock. The smirk that had once defined the room was gone, replaced by a flush creeping up Boehner's face as cameras recorded his stillness, and then the outside world caught fire. The clip hit Twitter before the echoes of Crockett's words even faded. One account posted it with the caption, "This is how you end arrogance in real time." Another simply wrote, "Boehner destroyed. Crockett Clapback." The hashtag surged within minutes, climbing trending lists not just nationally but globally. Alongside it came another, "Ours Boehner burn," a phrase born from Crockett's takedown that spread like wildfire. Memes followed at lightning speed. Screenshots of Boehner's fading smirk were paired with captions like, "Smile while you can," and "When the joke's on you." Side-by-side clips of his chuckle and her final line flooded TikTok, edited into cinematic montages with dramatic music. Instagram reels painted Crockett as the unflinching heroine of the hour, her calm composure elevated into legend. And then came the celebrity reactions. High-profile figures, actors, musicians, athletes, retweeted the clip with fire emojis, applause gifs, and words of admiration. One actor wrote, "Jasmine Crockett just reminded the world what dignity looks like." A musician added, "This isn't politics. This is justice." Crockett Clapback. Within hours, the video had been viewed millions of times across platforms, spawning reaction videos, duets, and breakdowns that amplified her moment into a movement. Grassroots pride poured in. Community leaders spoke about the validation they felt watching Crockett dismantle Boehner's arrogance. Young activists shared clips with captions like, "This is why we keep showing up," and "She speaks for us." The underdog had become the symbol of something larger, the fight against dismissiveness, the refusal to be laughed out of the room. Meanwhile, Boehner scrambled. His office issued a statement insisting his laugh was misunderstood, that it was light-hearted and taken out of context. But the internet wasn't buying it. Every attempt at damage control was met with screenshots, memes, and sharp replies that reminded him the moment was captured on video for all to see. The narrative was slipping further from his grasp with each passing hour. Commentators on major news networks weighed in almost instantly. Some called it the single most humiliating moment of Boehner's career. Others described it as a generational torch passing, the precise moment the old guard lost its grip on authority. Even those who had no love for Crockett admitted she had displayed poise under pressure that couldn't be ignored. The chamber itself buzzed with the aftershocks. Lawmakers who had once rolled their eyes at Crockett now looked at her differently. Staffers whispered in hallways, reporters swarmed with questions, and aides hustled to draft statements. The ripple effect had begun, a shift not just online, but in the machinery of politics itself. And through it all, Crockett remained composed. She didn't gloat, didn't rush to social media with victory laps. Her silence amplified the moment even more. It was the restraint of someone who knew she didn't need to chase validation. The world was already delivering it to her doorstep. Boehner, on the other hand, couldn't escape the weight of the ridicule. Late-night hosts replayed the clip with exaggerated chuckles, mocking the arrogance that had finally met its match. Editorial cartoons exaggerated his grin crumbling into dust. Op-eds framed the clash as a parable about the decline of the old political elite. The laughter that had once been his weapon was now turned against him, echoing across platforms not as dominance but as downfall. Each replay, each meme, each hashtag drove the point deeper. The smirk was gone, the laugh had ended, and dignity had prevailed. And then came the reactions that sealed his fate. In the days that followed, Jasmine Crockett's words reverberated far beyond the chamber walls. Commentators dissected them, activists quoted them, and everyday people, teachers, veterans, single parents, shared them with a sense of quiet pride. For once, it wasn't about partisan spin or tactical maneuvering. It was about something deeper, a reminder that dignity carries more power than derision, that truth cuts sharper than mockery. What struck people most wasn't just what Crockett said, but how she said it. She didn't shout. She didn't match Boehner's arrogance with anger. She chose restraint, clarity, and conviction. In that calm precision, she delivered a lesson that felt universal, that the measure of strength isn't in how loudly one laughs at others, but in how steadfastly one speaks for what is right, and the ripple effect was undeniable. Students in classrooms replayed the moment as an example of composure under fire. Community leaders invoked it in speeches about resilience. On social media, ordinary Americans described how the exchange reminded them of their own struggles, moments where they'd been dismissed, mocked or underestimated, and yet found the courage to answer with quiet strength. Crockett's stand became their story too. Boehner's laugh, once meant to belittle, had become a symbol of arrogance past its expiration date. Crockett's reply, on the other hand, carried forward as a touchstone of dignity. In a single exchange, the hierarchy shifted, the powerful old guard exposed as hollow, the underdog elevated into a figure of respect. This wasn't just a political moment. It was cultural. It was about the immigrant who had been told they didn't belong, the worker whose voice was ignored, the woman whose expertise was doubted. For all of them, Crockett's poise was proof. Being underestimated could be transformed into fuel, and every smirk could be silenced with truth. In a single exchange, one columnist wrote, dignity had silenced derision. The phrase spread quickly, printed on posters, echoed in rallies, even whispered among those who simply needed the reminder that arrogance doesn't last forever. And for those watching closely, the moral was crystal clear. Respect isn't something granted by the powerful. It's claimed by those who refuse to bow. Integrity isn't measured by status or title, but by the courage to stand firm when others try to laugh you down. Crockett had not just answered Boehner. She had redefined the terms of the debate. She showed that the true victory was not in humiliating an opponent, but in revealing that arrogance has no foundation when confronted by dignity. And as the nation replayed that clip, one thing became certain: this was more than a takedown. It was a turning point, a reminder that the laughter of the John Boehner laughed. Seconds later, it was over. What began as a smug chuckle meant to dismiss turned into the very sound that marked his undoing. In that moment, the arrogance of the old guard met the unshakable resolve of someone who refused to be mocked into silence. And the world saw the truth. Dignity will always outlast derision. This wasn't just about politics. It was about something bigger, about every person who's ever been laughed at for daring to speak, for daring to stand, for daring to exist with pride. Jasmine Crockett's poise reminded us all that courage doesn't come from titles, or money, or years in power. It comes from authenticity, from standing firm in truth, even when the room seems tilted against you. That's why this moment matters. Because it showed us that arrogance can be shattered, that truth can rise, and that dignity has the power to flip an entire narrative in seconds. If you believe in that lesson, if you believe in courage over mockery, in truth over empty laughter, then this story isn't just something to watch. It's something to share, because someone out there scrolling through their feed tonight needs to be reminded that their voice matters too. So don't just watch history, be part of it. Hit subscribe, share this video, and stand with us in lifting up the moments that prove what we all know deep down. That no smirk, no chuckle, no arrogance can ever outshine the power of dignity. Because in the end, Boehner laughed, and seconds later it was over.